In marketing materials, non-linear is often a synonym for good, but here's the thing, linear games are great too. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 5 linear game myths debunked. Starting off with number 5, the idea that linear games have low or no replay value, which, as somebody who would happily play all of the games they own over and over again throughout the late 80s and 90s, I don't know what to tell you. Out of my favorites from those times, I could easily go back to literally any of them and play them again, happily. In some ways, this is kind of the mentality that makes spoilers such a big problem, is that once you've seen the destination, apparently the journey is worthless. But the fact is, the original Doom was just re-released, and I'm just blazing through that. Don't even care that I've played it a million times. Do you know why people remake Super Mario levels in Super Mario Maker? It's not because they've never played them before. And yet, in each of these things, we all know exactly what to expect. A Sonic the Hedgehog level layout isn't going to suddenly change, and yet I'm happy to fire up Crash Bandicoot again. Now, this is not to dump on open world games. It's wonderful to have a massive place to just try anything in. But let's just go ahead and say this, if you've ever played through the Grand Theft Auto story of any Grand Theft Auto more than once, that's the linear portion of the game, and I've definitely played most of them more than once. Have you ever watched a movie more than once? Just because you liked it, not because you missed something. You just wanted to experience it again. Have you ever ridden a roller coaster more than once? Like, you definitely aren't going to be surprised about what comes on the roller coaster the second time around. The point is, not everything has to be 100% new for it to remain good. And in a lot of cases, like Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario, which are games that by all means are extremely linear, they have definite beginnings, middles, and endings of basically every aspect of the game, and yet you might end up doing something that surprises you. You don't have to play by the rules in a linear game. You can play around, mess things up. I named a couple of games there as experiences that I enjoy going through time and time again. I mean, I could pop basically any Final Fantasy game in, and on a scale between linear and non-linear, they're not like pegged at linear, but they're pretty linear. And yet, surely enough, once a year I play a classic Final Fantasy. Sometimes it's about getting better at a thing you've already experienced, sometimes it's just about seeing the sights again. It doesn't matter, but linear games definitely have replay value when they're good. Similarly, an open world game that is bad doesn't have a lot of replay value, does it? Happens to depend a bit more on the quality than the category, eh? Moving on to number 4, the idea that linear games are somehow dying. For instance, that single-player narrative games are just something that people don't want. This one particularly pisses me off because we get things like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, where a massive amount of effort goes into a modestly budgeted game and it's a huge hit because it's something that people want. Gears of War 4 had a multiplayer element, but I mean, I know that a lot of people buy Gears of War specifically for the single player game, and well over 6 million people have played the game, as of an estimate 2 years ago when player totals were accidentally leaked to a bunch of games. And let's not forget that Sonic Mania was the big success it was for Sega when that happened. They were unprepared for how successful that game was. And, you know, we could say these 3 words and basically resolve the whole argument. But should we? Actually, yes, we should. God of War. Back in May of this year, Sony announced that 10 million people had bought God of War, which made it not only the best-selling God of War game, also rated higher on Metacritic than the previous God of War game, which was largely heralded as a massive success. Are there any other big PS4 single-player games? Oh, right, Uncharted 4, which sold 15 million copies. And these games are exclusives. They're not even multi-platform games that everybody has access to. Do we want to talk about the re-release of Last of Us on PS4? Because it sold over 10 million copies too. Re-release. Game that's already been out. This ties into point 5. The game's got such replay value that going through it again on another console for another $60 is so worth it, tons of people bought it. And do we even need to talk about the various indie games out there that are extremely linear in construction? There's a reason why the indie community has become such a big thing, becoming borderline not indie. There's a lot of mid-tier publishers that are snapping up these little studios that are creating these amazing linear games that are constructed with love and an attention to detail. When companies say they want to do live services because of poor sales of single-player games, it's what you would call a flat-out lie. It's marketing, it's nothing more. These games sell well, they just don't make as many of them anymore. Moving on to number 3, when people say linear games don't give the player agency. This ties back into point 5 as well, in that I'm not so sure people would replay games if they felt they had no agency at all. And I think that in open worlds, player agency is sometimes a bit exaggerated too. First off, do you remember Half-Life 2? Do you remember how it's a linear game with a definite story, and yet it's also basically a physics sandbox game? This is a good case for why we should just stop looking at games as linear or non-linear, as if it's one or the other for sure. Because at its core, a game may be linear but give you these non-linear elements to tinker around with, or you might even be able to force them into the game yourself in some respects. Simply having a beginning and end and a definite set of goals to complete between those 2 points makes a game linear, but it doesn't mean you're stuck. And in some respects, you could even say by limiting the move set, any game limits a player's agency. Let's say I want to fly in this completely open world, non-linear sandbox game and it doesn't have the option. Is it suddenly a linear game? No, because we don't judge linear based on those things. And also, that thing isn't necessarily good or bad in of itself. It's bad if you want to fly, but let's say maybe the game itself is better without flying, or doesn't call for flying at all. Let's say that's a weird demand on your part. When you play like a, let's say, open-ended turtle simulation game and say, I want my turtle to fly. When they don't accommodate that, they're technically limiting agency. But I really want to stress the word technically. They're only limiting your agency in a technical sense. Similarly, when a game presents you with a choice, that doesn't necessarily make it non-linear. It might simply be a fork in the linear road, and yet, technically, that's agency. These are all fairly low-level, simple examples, but ultimately the real agency you're exercising is if you want to play the game at all. And if you do, there's probably a reason for that. Moving on to number 2, the idea that linear games are quote-unquote easy and don't have enough skill-based challenging mechanics. Which, I mean, cool. I've heard people complain about Dark Souls, for instance, being too linear, and yet still call it their favorite game. I've actually talked to a lot of people who say these exact 2 things. And if you spend time with Dark Souls, you can certainly improve to a point where it looks effortless. But if somebody called Dark Souls easy, they're either the best gamer, just like out of the womb, doctor, I think we have a gamer, or, and forgive me if this seems unreasonable, but perhaps they played Dark Souls for a long enough period of time that it actually seems easy to them. You know the phrase, get good? People say it for a reason, that there are people who actually get very good at video games. Now, keeping in mind it often entails spending lots of time getting good, and not everybody has the time to get good, but the phrase isn't get non-linear. In fact, what is a fairly popular phrase actually applies to the much more linear aspects of non-linear games, for instance. Getting good involves repetition, and it's significantly more linear to go from not good to practicing a lot to being good than it is to just wander around in the non-linear world. Now, that's not saying that because there's a progression system in a game, it's linear, but it is saying even non-linear games have elements that more or less harken to the linear expectations one might have. And again, there's a lot of games that are like Sonic the Hedgehog where, when they're done right, they're these amazing courses that you can continually refine your skills and improve your time or score count in some way. It's not to say there aren't a lot of bad Sonic the Hedgehog games that don't bother with any of that, but I wasn't even really talking specifically about Sonic the Hedgehog. Lots of games work like this, in lots of different genres, and technically they're really linear, but the whole game is based around skill in some way. Which brings us to our final point, the idea that a linear game is not as immersive as an open world. Now, the definition of immersion that best fits what we're referring to when we call a game immersive is a deep mental involvement. And let's just go ahead and say that could be anything. If you don't get immersed in linear games, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just you probably don't like linear games. Which, again, there's nothing wrong with. I would never say you're wrong for that. I would say it's wrong to say that people don't get immersed in linear games, though, or that they are not immersive. We're talking about a difference in expectation and desire as to what the game itself is. Again, I want linear games and non-linear games, but you'll often see me very vocally defend linear games over non-linear games. And that's because they immerse me, and a lot of people just say it's not immersive, which it's not true. Again, people don't spend $60 on things that are just categorically unimmersive. Oh, it's non-linear? Well, that means I don't want it because it's not immersive. Like, that's such an arbitrary statement because a linear game might be based around a narrative. And if a narrative is good, it's immersive. You want to know what happens next. You're on the edge of your seat. You're involved. You're engaged. Or let's say we're talking about a very linear puzzle game. Don't tell me people who get into those games aren't just wildly immersed, moving their bodies as they move little parts of a game board around. Honestly, I think the right thing to understand here is an old and simple adage, different strokes for different folks. One's not better than the other, one's just categorically different than the other. And ultimately, that's really what we're talking about. It's assigning a false binary of good or bad to categorical statements that are not value judgments, but instead objective observations. Linear, non-linear, are categorical, and according to your taste, may correlate with good or bad, but don't inherently correlate with good or bad. And immersive itself might mean different things to different people, as well as what an acceptable level of immersion is and what causes a game to be immersive. So there. Here's the thing. A lot of these narratives arise out of marketing materials and what CEOs say, and you always have to remember those things are about what they want, and not what you want. They want to make money. You want a good game. Don't let them convince you that any category of game is bad because the other category makes them more money. If you like this video, please click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week, and the best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe and don't forget to click the notification bell. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.